welcome in. This is Wind Reel and Print. My name is Kevin.
And my name's Ryan.
Thanks. And we're here. Oh, yeah. We're here welcoming in our guest for today, Sam. How's it going, Sam?
It's going great. Thank you so much for having me.
I think thank you, Kevin, for really butchering that opening. I think but that feels right. It feels like the kind of conversations we have. So respect.
Yeah, we're kind of finding it in the edit. Like it's gonna work out.
It's happening. It's happening.
Ooh, yeah. We can connect this back to some Altman-esque stuff too. Maybe talking over each other. Yeah.
Exactly. So I guess that's a good way to introduce the topic for today. Director Robert Altman, featuring 4 films that Sam has brought in for us. Sam, I guess you could intro the 4 films and kind of talk about why you chose Robert Altman and why you chose these 4 films in general.
Perfect. So like off the top, it's McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Nashville, Secret Honor, and then Shortcuts. And I kind of wanted to pick some films of like, I'm honestly not really sure like where Robert Altman fits into like the canon of like people talking about it. He kind of has this like David Lynch thing where it's like the people who know him, and we know the name and it's floating around. But there's also this kind of sense of like, I'm not really sure if he crosses over mainstream in the same way. And there is very like specific idiosyncrasies he has. So I kind of wanted to like pick films that people are able to get, maybe not even as like sort of like films that people might not necessarily find on their own as much as they are discussed, and movies that kind of like, I think all his movies prove that he has something very interesting to say, but the ones that almost feel kind of like antithetical to what like an Altman trope is. And I feel like a lot of that is kind of exemplified or sort of built upon in these films.
Define for us what you would consider like a Robert Altman trope.
I mean, just like the overlapping dialogue and the fact that like all his films have this very like, I noticed this when I first saw MASH, these kind of not sitcom in pacing, but very sort of like slice of life elements, even though they're within a genre. You know, he drops us into a genre or a situation, and then we just kind of watch it happen. And it feels very like omniscient and like very guided and very pointed, and we're looking at what he wants, but almost in real time, where the camera will zoom in and then move over to what you're looking at. Like it's done in the edit, but you also feel that there's just this sort of sense of life happening all around you that I think is really interesting. And it kind of happens in like, we'll get to it, but like I feel a lot of that is in Secret Honor, even though that has none of really what makes Robert Altman, even though like to me that's a quintessential Altman film.
Yeah, I was just about to say, once you know Altman and have seen it, Secret Honor definitely feels like the perfect encapsulation, even though it does so many different things. But especially after like reading, like I read his Wikipedia article. Okay,
nice.
Sue me. That's what I read beginning, and so I know his life from that. Yeah. But even like it also feels like a perfect look into exactly the kind of career he had as well, bouncing off of all of these different things, plays being something he fell back into. I think that does really relate to all of his other films too. I think it was a great choice to add to the repertoire.
Thank you. I also think you can go first.
Well, I was just gonna add, when you mentioned like antithetical to the Altman trope, I immediately thought of Secret Honor, because it kind of, you would think it's not what he would normally do, but it's almost exactly what he would do, as Brian said. Anyways,
I think just to kind of wind it a little bit back to also understand your connection with Altman. Do you remember what your first Altman viewing experience was?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I think it was Nashville. Just because I had and you guys have actually talked about in a previous episode that 1001 movies to see before you die book, and he was one of those guys where like he was always sort of in the lexicon, and like I grew up going to the library and a lot of his films are around and you see iconography, and like the first one that I very distinctly remember is like the video box of Long Goodbye, and sort of through that learning who Elliot Gould is and knowing about MASH, but through the TV show and all these different elements of like kind of like my thesis for this is that like it's kind of rare now, I feel like, and I think it's a really important part of filmmaking that you kind of discover certain filmmakers and filmmakers that kind of just fall into your lap versus like if someone says you need to watch Spielberg or you need to watch De Palma or Fellini, you're going there for a reason. Where Altman, it was almost this weird, like kind of like retroactive thing of like I knew about those movies through the book. I remember it was MASH, Long Goodbye, Nashville, Shortcuts, The Player, and then McCabe and Mrs. Miller. And so, and in my mind, I was like, oh, those are the quote unquote good Robert Altman movies. But the thing that was weird was after like seeing some of those, I saw some other ones, and none of them stood out so much or became like, this is my personality or this is a linchpin. But they all stuck with me equally. The ones that I didn't like Brewster McCloud's like now one of my favorite ones. And it was one of those movies where you just feel kind of like there's something almost kind of trolling about it, which is weird to say considering like his mainstream films have that same element to them.
Yeah.
But they all kind of grow with you and you really kind of sit with them and kind of over time you realize like, oh, it's not my favorite movie the minute it finished, but it's a movie that's very much like impacted me in a very strong way. So in its own kind of weird way, it kind of becomes your favorite movie over time. And I think you can kind of say that about like any of his movies, depending on what your relationship to them are.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll like even watching it like mid-watch it, I'm hating it at the start and loving it by the end. And specifically it was McCabe and Mrs. Miller. You get like the perfect encapsulation of the audio thing that everyone kind of talks about with Altman. So much overlapping audio inside that little bar and everything like that. It was it felt like a nightmare. It felt like I was having a panic attack. And it also then we kind of get to like the town and it's like very focused on like sex work and everything like that. And it felt just kind of like it had like this disregard a little bit to it, but then the movie uses that and plays off of it. And it becomes actually like the point of the film. And then you start to really feel the energy that is being built. And specifically, I mean, I can't just to say this before I forget it. The set in McCabe and Mrs. Miller is unbelievable. And from the things that I read, they built it. It was one of those very lucky films where they shoot chronologically. Those don't happen all that often. And they were building the set as it went, because for those that don't know, it's like a Wild West town. And the carpenters that were building it were dressed in period costumes, were building it with period appropriate tools while filming was happening. And doesn't that also feel so Altman to have like it feels like no plan. And you read kind of what Elliot Gould and Donald Sutherland were saying about like MASH at the start, which is like, what is this guy doing? Like, he's not a professional. Like, there's all of these things, but then you start to realize, like, this is it. Like, it is a subversion of what we think it takes to make a movie. And it makes sense why Altman was disliked by every money person in Hollywood, because just couldn't do it the way they wanted to. And writer, too. A lot of writers did not like him as well.
Yeah, he's a really fascinating figure in sort of like his level of collaboration. And like even like to your point with McCabe and Miss Miller, I was reading that the costume designer wasn't instructed to costume people, but was set to get like bulk levels of costumes, and they laid them out, and his character introduction, everyone would go and kind of pick out what their character was.
And
certain people
that.
had access to certain things. And even the sort of evolution of like the script soup on McCabe and Mrs. Miller, it plays the sex worker who they sing it's her birthday, they bring the birthday cake to in the brothel. But then because that they needed another script soup, so he got like up and coming writers to be in the background who were script soups, because fans that he didn't use a script soup, but you kind of have to hire it for studio reasons. And it's like none of it should work. It should all double back on itself.
Wow. I always say this. It's amazing that films get made in general. Like it is just like what a feat to do it at all. But my God, for an Altman film to get made is also astounding. That any of them were able to make it. And then just hearing about the editing process of McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which took longer than the shooting itself, is also just like there's so many things with that film in particular where it's like, man, I'm blown away that it got made and makes sense, especially coming from like the Altman kind of perspective that I've kind of begin have begun to discover, which is just not so much of a focus on story and plot and just like seeing what happens, which is
He
Hmm.
was
very cool.
he was definitely like a really early influence on me in a kind of bizarre way, in that like I was very influenced in my writing and structuring through his films, and yet I kind of had this aha moment of like, but it's interesting how through that I mean, not to say it was effective or anything, but created something different, because his stuff kind of becomes that out of happenstance. Like he's not structuring it in a way where you'll see like Paul Thomas Anderson or like Inarritu or like these people who like feel like they have elements of him in them, but are very like exacting in a very precise way, as
Yes.
opposed to like he sets the world and kind of just lets it run.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Oh, go for it, Kevin. I'm talking a lot.
No, you're good. You're good. I feel like just to piggyback, like he's like organizing chaos. Like he's
Yeah.
just kind of allowing the process of the filmmaking to be the film itself. In the video, they show a clip of an interview where he kind of mentions that like um at the time they hadn't really understood like the cinematic form yet.
Yeah.
Like we were still derivative of like novels and plays and vaudeville and like all these kind of archaic art forms,
Hmm.
that there was still like room to like understand what like film could be and do and stuff.
He
And
had
then
this
yeah, it's just the way he would treat the production process and then actors and everything was very rebellious to the like tradition and process, I guess, that like most people are known for.
yeah, he had
Would Yeah, understood. Yeah, anyway, sorry.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No,
What
you're
was
good.
it?
You're good.
There was yeah, there's this really great interview with him on like Dick Cavett where he talks about, I think it might have been McCabe Miss Miller, where he basically like says a lot of what you're just discussing in regards of like making it pure cinema. And it's really interesting how you kind of see him trying to do that, but you also see these really like specific removed moments that feel to me like a really good encapsulation of that. Where like he doesn't do
Mm,
it in every movie, but he has this thing that I've kind of become obsessed with, where if he cuts to an insert that's visually motivated, he has the insert be MOS. So it almost exists in this like kind of time out of space almost. So you're fully
Interesting.
looking at what you're doing, but you don't disconnect from the audio. And
Mm.
these kind of like little things that kind of like keep you, it kind of holds your hand in terms of where we're headed, but it also is very clear in terms of like, well, you got to look at this or you got to talk about this. And it almost kind of has this like interesting like Kuleshov effect, but less in terms of story and more in terms of like your awareness of the space.
Yeah.
mm,
Yeah. I wonder, that makes me think about how he like uses the camera work and how like he
mhm,
really
mhm.
encouraged finding things as you went. I think what he chooses to be subjects is very uniquely Altman. And so yeah, what he focuses on, that's a very interesting thing to think about. Hmm.
Especially too, like to bring it back to McCabe and Miss Miller, the use of wide shots, which is like
Mhm.
I feel like kind of odd to say in a Western, but like the way he uses the wide shots and really emphasizes like indoor and outdoor and personal moments, and how there aren't a lot of private moments, but there really is a distinction between like you're here with these people and then you're out in the cold. And there's no
Mhm.
middle ground in a way. And everything just feels so like sparse and kind of barren, but you kind of start to see this like kind of birth of innovation.
I definitely didn't understand it until like the third act.
Yeah, I feel like it kind of brings you back at that moment. And to me, it feels like one of like the essential like new Hollywood films in like especially like we talk a lot
Mm.
about in 1971 you have I mean 1968 you have Bullet, then in 19 this will make sense in a second. I'll show back. Um you got French Connection, Shaft, and Dirty Harry, and they're all like three different takes on the cop genre. But to me, like all of those movies are different forms of westerns, just kind of instilled with modern things and
Mhm.
modern elements, and sort of like it's so Clint Eastwood with a gun and there's standoffs and he's fighting crazy people and there's chases. Whereas like with McCabe Mister, it's almost like the opposite of like it's this really small film about like sex workers and small business owners, but it's set in a time where it's like the birth of innovation. And it's this really interesting, like even almost a juxtaposition to like the Wild Bunch, which takes place at the same time, but that's like
Mm.
further south down in Mexico. It's like that's the end of the phase of the cowboy.
Yeah.
And And the thing with McCabe and Miss Miller is it's on one hand it's saying like that phase is ending and a new world is being built, but also I feel like on some level it's making the argument that that world kind of never existed. Like the only guy who's like a quote unquote like traditional cowboy is Keith Carradine, who like dies so quickly, and it's just such like a kind of like tragic throwaway moment. And it's almost like comical how it plays out in relation to everything else. And yet when that moment happens, it's just like such a distilled kind of timepiece of like it's not nothing kind of before or after matters. We're just like with these characters.
The video that I had watched was comparing McCabe to the Wild Bunch, and in that like their reason was like Peckinpah is more like satirical, more like heavy-handed with that,
Yeah.
whereas Altman has like kind of an what like a sentimentality to him, like with the characters and stuff like that. Like I really see, especially in this film, like Tarantino uh in his work, just like the way he riffs off genre, and then just like the dialogue kind of being this stilted, like against the genre in a way,
Yeah.
like becomes real people in the genre thing. Um, yeah.
That's also too why I kind of keep coming back to it is that like it kind of feels like a film in a way that like time has caught up with, where like as much as it was a time capsule, to me it feels like it was a failed time capsule of its time. But he was putting all this stuff in play that like really kind of like made it work for what it is now. Whereas like it's one of the first movies where like everyone's using lavalier mics so they can mix all the different tracks. Whereas by the time he's doing the player, like I saw there's an interview with Benny Safdie. He's saying they tried to do it on Uncut Gems, and it like even at that point they weren't able to do it because Altman on the player had 26 recording tracks, and he would just put plug mixers into mixers into mixers, and then they ran it out of a van that was almost, it was like a surveillance van, like in like the Conversation, like what John Cazale drives, and it would just like kind of catch everything that's around it, which is like insane to think about. But like the fact that we still kind of can't do that today
Yeah,
because
it's
he's
not
just sort of
possible.
making it up. Whereas like you look at like the film, it's like everyone talks about how like weird and dark that movie is, but like the fact that they flash the image to make it look like an old photograph, it's like as like it's being remastered and now they just like did like a 4K, all the colors are coming out, and these colors that they just didn't know were there because on the film negative like a lot of them are crushed but the information's still there. So it's almost like we just kind of had to like wait a generation to like find all these kind of like little things that you kind of dig around that sort of become more apparent in every viewing.
Yeah, it makes sense why we like it does feel like such a unique Altman thing to have kind of the overlapping audio and to take it so much, because I mean it just doesn't seem like anyone wanted to really do that at all.
Yeah.
So it's I guess it isn't very surprising that that just kind of got lost in
I
kind of
mean,
like Hollywood history.
that was kind of started with Hawks. Like he kind of had a lot of overlapping dialogue, which was against the grain back then too.
Yeah.
And even his stuff is kind of interesting though, because I feel like with Hawks, there's this weird like charm to it, where like the ways in which he's using lavalier mics and is switching between channels mid take, like it's almost like he's capturing it almost in this sort of like Brechtian way. Whereas like I feel like Altman reaches this kind of purpose of like there are definitely Altman films that like are kind of unintelligible, or like I see the idea, but it's not really coming together.
Yeah.
I feel like Altman is reaching more for the realism in it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you said, just laying out the world and then like just capturing it without disturbing it too much.
Yeah.
It feels like, yeah, like with the audio, with like the zoom lens.
Yeah.
Like it's very voyeuristic almost.
Yeah.
Like,
And he
yeah.
has this kind of like omniscient approach to like
Yeah.
death that I find interesting. That like to me, the kind of like the modern version is like, and I think we can kind of cover it when we get to shortcuts, but like Birdman to me feels very Altman-esque, kind of more literal version, but also like more like because we're technologically further along, we can sort of push it in interesting directions. Where like he's had long takes, but he never had a one shot in that way because we weren't at that point yet, or even like the editing techniques weren't there to even simulate that.
Right.
I do we think just imagining a scenario like Altman would like, part of me feels
with the tech.
yeah, like it is a one take film of an alt. Like, do you think he'd go in there? Because it does feel like he is so into chopping things
Yeah,
in strange ways. It is an interesting thought to be like, because I'd never put like the Birdman connection, but that does feel
Yeah.
very Altman. Would be
I would
really weird.
I would consider it if he's like doing it as like like a mockumentary
yeah,
sort of thing
Mm,
where it's
yeah,
just like, hey, we're gonna have all these characters in one space. We're gonna have them all mic'd up. They're all gonna like have their own situations,
yeah,
and then we're gonna have like 4 or 5 cameras like rolling in there, like doing the thing, and then like maybe it's not a one take, but it'll feel like one takey, you know?
yeah,
I don't know. I feel like it's in his wheelhouse to kind of like go
yeah.
there. You know what I mean?
I think it's
Oh, that would be a
definitely,
fun movie. I'm just kind
yeah.
of
No, that would be great. Because I
like
think
a
he,
political party convention with like a bunch of TV cameras, like dress up all the camera people as like TV camera people, and then like go around shooting like different people
he actually
acting
made this film
with
that
real
like
people as background. Yeah, sorry.
I almost oh no worries. It's like sorry, I was talking over. Like we really
Yeah, it's all
appreciate
good.
it.
It's
No,
all good.
yeah.
no, it's good.
Oh,
And there's actually a film that I almost recommended, but like kind of stayed away from just because like weirdly it's not really available. It has like really like kind of crappy like rips on YouTube. But he made this movie called
mm.
Health, which is like he
I
called it
read
like
about that.
his
Yeah.
version of Nashville, but for the 80s. And it's like health food conventions. And like Dick Cavett plays
Mm.
himself. And it's like either, I'll have to double check, but it's either right before or right after Ronald Reagan was elected. So there's a lot of like this sort of like faux change that's going around that's really funny. And it has a lot of that. I'm trying to think if he did like ever did like a news anchor film. That would have
Oh
been
yeah,
great.
like
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I think
Mm.
network, I think that
Yeah.
feels almost kind of like it has that sort of feel. But I to think of to suppose and to imagine this Altman one take makes a lot of sense. He did a lot of plays,
hmm
operas, and things like that. And what's really the difference in that? I mean, I think he loved to just see what would happen. And if the
Yeah.
tech was there, yeah, that does sound like a really interesting thing. And for what I also read about health, which is kind of interesting, is that it was shelved for multiple years.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and it makes sense. I mean, it's just
Why?
another in a long thing. I think it just was not, and maybe it was because of the Reagan election. Um, it was
Also,
the
that's been
last, yeah, it was the last film he did with 20th Century Fox, shelved it for 2 years. Um, and then, yeah, it's also just really hard to find it anywhere. There's obviously something I'd have to read a little
Oh,
bit more, but yeah.
I also think too it
dude.
has something to do with the fact that like I think it was shot before Popeye, but like once Popeye comes out, that kind of sinks him in terms of
hmm
like the Altman style. 'Cause I think that's also another movie that's very like I mean overall I think it's very underrated. I also think there's a lot of it being underrated in terms of how much of an Altman film it is.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
Yeah.
know,
yeah,
and like it's big cast is running through and it's a lot of improvisation and there's a lot of
hmm
stuff in there that I think like because that movie whether it was suited for it or not didn't fully connect with audiences that style was seen as like hazardous.
yeah. And I'll also say it's equally as ugly as McCabe and Mrs. Miller,
Yeah,
too. Like there is
yeah,
just this
hmm
really, which you wouldn't, I would think that like if they were to do a Popeye movie now, you can imagine the bright, almost like Adventures of Tintin
yeah,
style color scheme and everything like that. You can
Mm.
imagine a totally different world. But this was like Popeye meets McCabe and Mrs. Miller. It feels
yeah.
very much all of this kind of dreary wooden structures and um yeah, and just really strange.
Sounds fun.
Yeah.
It's
Um,
fascinating. I mean, if you're on your like Cat in the Hat kick, it very much like
mm,
satisfies a
Yeah.
lot of that kind of speed racer, very formalist. Like it might be political, but also it might just kind of be madcap. Like it kind of operates on all these different levels that I find really
yeah.
interesting.
I think it's probably a good time. We've talked a lot about McCabe and Mrs.
Yeah.
Miller. So let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit about Nashville. I think that's probably a good one to jump into. Um, wow.
Well,
Yeah.
Oh, do you have something you want to add, Kevin, before we move
I
further?
just feel like maybe a good connecting point is
Mm,
like um Buffalo Bill and like
Uh,
I didn't get to see it, but I heard about it in the video. And I guess just in the way like Altman captures portraits of America,
yeah.
like specifically.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I'm curious if you have like anything to say on that.
I really love that movie, but I kind of find it fascinating. Of like, I almost sort of, it's funny. Up until recently, I thought of it more as like a Paul Newman movie because Paul Newman has this whole through line where he made like a handful of like really sort of quote unquote important, serious political movies, and none of them hit. And then the
Mm.
response is this movie, and then a couple years, I think it's a year before this, maybe a few, he made this film called The Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean, which is fascinating,
Mm,
which is George Roy Hill coming off while making this The Sting and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and he's like about to make Slapshot. Is that there's something? Oh wait, actually, I take that back. That's not Judge Roy Hill. It's actually a John Huston film. Is like sort of how the humor can undercut all these sort of myths of people, and like even like with Buffalo Bill, there was a story where Altman really wanted Paul Newman to like learn how to be bad on a horse.
Mm.
Whereas like he can do the big like the giant when you ride up and the horse goes up on two like and there's a scene on Buffalo Bill where it jumps and the horse bucks and he almost falls off and it's all like choreographed, but in like this really kind of and I also think that's a movie that like it almost takes in a way like Nashville and McCabe Miller one step further in that it's fundamentally about performers and this
Mm.
sort of
hmm
layering of like these guys are not just commenting on their personas or where they are in relation to their careers, but also the nature of performance and the nature of where we're at. Like I've seen a couple of comments with like comparing Warren Beatty to like John Wayne and the Searchers or like Ryan O'Neal and Barry Lyndon. It's like an interesting comparison, but like I always felt like those guys are kind of being, and I think for the betterment of the movie, like also they're kind of famous for like sort of being assholes. So you kind of softens the blow of
Yeah.
they're kind of being exploited for their persona, even to the degree that maybe they don't realize what this movie's saying. We're like with McCabe, the movie opens and I feel like you think Warren Beatty's doing that. And then as you realize, like, no, that's what McCabe is doing. And Warren Beatty is very clear and very sure of like what he's doing in a performance to find the humanity and sort of
hmm
find the cowardice and all the bullshit that kind of lies within this character.
hmm
Yeah. Yeah. It's also like, I imagine, even if it was shot differently, how much worse Warren Beatty's performance might have felt.
Yeah.
Like there was just like it felt like Altman needed to be there to also kind of make it happen. There was just, I don't know, it just felt like a little bit of a confluence of these things. Cause there's times in Warren Beatty's performance where it's just like, what the hell is what
Yeah.
but I think that's just like the character's a coward, and I think
Yeah.
that's probably what I was getting off of it, and it was probably just hitting me, and I was just like, "Fuck this guy."
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, but
It's
yeah,
so stilted. It is like anti-genre. Like it's
Yeah.
yeah,
playing
yeah.
against what you
Maybe
expect
that's what it
these characters
is.
are doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That it's just kind of like anti-Western in a way. And it's been a while since I've
Right.
seen Dead Man, the Jim Jarmusch film, but
Oh,
I know that's
Mm.
kind of an anti-Western, or
yeah.
like takes different ideas of it. I need to watch that again. That just makes me think of that. But that's an
Yeah.
interesting kind of genre or way to attack this. And I don't know. Would you say Buffalo Bill? I haven't seen Buffalo Bill.
I
Would you
haven't
say
either.
that
Yeah.
that's also kind of an anti-Western, or is that just like a Western with a different hat on?
I think it's like definitely an anti-Western, but in a more like overt way where like there is this sort of like bizarre subtlety to McCabe and Mrs. Miller where it's like it took me a couple of viewings to realize like, oh, like we're subverting the sort of high noon last stand trope because no one's paying attention to him.
hmm
And he's over
Yeah.
here and he's shooting people in the back and he's walking around. Where like Buffalo Bill is very much like a movie about like sort of quote unquote like men who are heroes and then you
hmm
realize like it's all bullshit and it's very like clearly like stated out in that way of like this guy got famous through telling stories about these battles and some of them happened and some of them didn't, and the fact that like a lot of these guys went around but he like in his lifetime created a play and a circus show. And even the fact that like this started out as a play, I think there was sort of like a kind of meta narrative in regards to Buffalo Bill being a play that got turned into a movie about a circus, about this country, and how we mythologize all of this. Like it all just
Yeah.
kind of doubles back on itself.
Yeah. Once again, I think I don't know if I said it just off podcast, but I think I did. But I mean, talk about Altman being at just the right point at the right time. I think the bicentennial was like he was the exact person to be there to say something. And it also makes me love him even more that so many of his movies just did not hit when they first came out. Like almost none of them. Every time I read something on Wikipedia about one poorly received at the time. I mean, it's just like it never ends, and it's pretty cool that we can watch them now and be like, oh, that's interesting. And that to kind of talk about Nashville a little bit. That also was a very I mean, watching it, and I was able to watch it in like beautiful 4K. It was crazy, the quality of it. And I've never seen a movie more 70s in my life. Like it was such an interesting time capsule to look at. And so it plays up kind of like what the 70s is, or at least, I don't know if any of us are equipped to talk too much about like what was happening at the bicentennial and everything like that. But it says the ending was it said such a powerful, resonant thing that still resonates to this day. I mean, he had the thumb on the pulse a little bit is really how it feels to me. And I'm wondering what you guys kind of like take away from like how he sees kind of the political leanings. And I mean, just how, I guess nothing has changed in a way, but
I think he's really good at sort of like setting up environments. And once we drop all these people into it, what does that say about us?
Yeah.
Because like I didn't realize too, I was reading that he was saying that there wasn't a through line and everything was all broken up. And it was kind of supposed to be Geraldine Chaplin as the reporter, but even that got kind of lost because she goes in different directions.
Yeah.
And then so he added the what is it, the van for the political campaign as like kind of the thrill. And to me, I always thought that was satire, but he's stated somewhere, I think it was in one of his books, that he was like, that was the genuine thing. I was like, all these people are full of shit, and I want like, who's the ideal candidate? Michael Murphy's corrupt. Ronnie Blakely is like sort of like, she's not doing anything wrong, but at the same time, like so much of like the notion of celebrity and like how that like has changed a little bit, but really like hasn't, is really sort of being foisted onto her. And then like just sort of just one reminder of like, it's all political. It's all happening, and it's all just kind of going around.
True. Yeah, I guess that is a good point. Like now that I'm like a couple weeks removed from having seen it, I kind of lost how political it was through the entire time. Yeah, I got lost a little bit in the music, and then the ending really says something.
Yeah.
And then kind of like also just kind of gets back into entertainment. But yeah, no, it really was the entire time making a political statement.
Yeah, like I remember like you go.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was just gonna say he's kind of foreshadowing the way politics and celebrityism kind of interact in going into like contemporary politics now. Like he's kind of predicting the future in a lot of ways.
Yeah, he has this kind of really interesting way, I feel like, especially with the editing in that film, of like very pointedly aiming at specific views. Like I remember there's this one shot that I've just been kind of like mulling over, of like when she's singing at the end in the song, it says "we were together," and right when it cuts to that, it cuts to the American flag, and it's this really kind of bizarre insert that doesn't really make sense, that like I thought was weird and was kind of funny, and like is kind of unifying in this really kind of fucked way. And then once you've seen it, you're like, oh, that's like a harbinger. That's not something that's good. It's like, what's going to happen. And even too, like the ways in which the guy who turns out to be the assassin and Scott Glenn, who's the soldier, are very much framed as like parallel narratives the whole movie. And then when they finally come together, like they're next to each other and he shoots her and Scott Glenn can't do anything. Like no one can save anybody. Yeah. And it's almost like retroactive, but it's funny that like I didn't think he was gonna save her watching it the first time, because you're kind of overwhelmed by everything. And then by the time you watch it again, you see what he's doing, but because you know it's gonna happen, it like really solidifies the dramatic irony.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And then he just walks away, right?
Yeah,
There at the end. Like after
yeah,
it's done, he just like slowly walks away as if
yeah,
like it's really not,
Nothing happened.
yeah,
yeah.
it's like it's kind of meaningless. And oh my God, that one hurt. But yeah, oh yeah, the great comment on the flag too, and talking about unified. And I guess, does anyone have any like insight into like, because I'm trying to understand the bicentennial a little bit to kind of
Okay.
understand the place in this. And I guess it was just like my understanding is a very highly politicized
Yeah,
time of just celebration of America, um,
I
for
think
it, yeah,
it
for its values and everything.
was, but I think the thing that he's commenting on that a lot of people like have kind of fallen out of fashion with is that it was a very highly politicized time for the right because
Mm.
of everything that was going on. Of like, if you look at the last 10 years, we have Watergate, we have Vietnam, there's Martin Luther
Mm.
King, JFK is about, 13 years earlier, there's
Yeah.
RFK, there's I think it's George Wallace was there was a like a right wing senator who got shot. Like
Yeah.
everyone, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, everyone was getting killed, and suddenly it's 200 years, so we have to really rally
Hmm.
together and be happy, And it's like this movie,
Hmm.
Oh, that's
like
so.
it either did I don't know if it lost to it or if it was the year before, but it comes out within a year of Rocky, and it's like that's
Oh,
the like
whoa.
this is
Same
the
year,
victory moment. Yeah,
I
so it
think.
lost, didn't it lose
We
for
lost
Best
to
Picture?
Rocky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas like there's a moment too. I mean, even like slowly every time I watch it, it gets more fun because you pick up a different character to kind of follow.
I think.
And this time around, the guy that I really liked was Henry Gibson, who he's the older guy with the mutton chops who's in like the jumpsuit. He's gonna get
Yes.
shot in the arm at the end. Like there's this really bizarre, like kind of trailing shot at the beginning where it's going through the gospel and showing everyone singing. And there's a line in there, I don't remember the exact line, about something about maybe this will be better by 2076. And his face
Hmm.
goes dead when he says that. And it's the funniest thing.
Oh my God.
And this kind of like, this is what the movie's starting with. And then the movie ends with him getting shot, but also like being able to walk away and not really learning from it.
I want to correct myself. Nashville lost to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's
To
Nest.
75, right?
Yeah, Rocky
Okay.
won the year
Rocky came out a
after.
year
Yeah.
after.
Yeah, sorry.
But still, I
We'll
mean,
see.
just like, yeah, it is interesting the movies that are coming out and that are being, well, yeah, I guess what is One Flew Over the Cuckoo? Maybe that's a conversation for another time
Yeah.
what that says, but also just best picture winners. That's why we got to do more of those
Yeah.
best picture winner kind of like look at the decade, because
A
they do say very interesting things about the time, not
Yeah.
necessarily. Mm.
Jaws came out the same year, not also
Yeah.
nominated for Best Picture.
Yeah.
Just
Jaws
It's a
came out.
weird.
Wow, really?
Isn't Barry Lyndon
yeah.
that year too? Like it's a
Yeah,
really
Barry
weird
Lyndon
lineup
also
of
nominated.
best
Dog
pictures.
Day Afternoon.
Oh
Yeah.
my God! Wow, what an awesome
Which
year!
also
Holy.
like
Yeah, it was
quietly I feel
pretty
like is a
dope.
really good like underrated movie about like what it says about America and like us as a people.
Barry Lyndon?
Dog Afternoon
Oh,
is
totally.
just like
Yeah.
this like great like again it's a genre piece, but at the same time there's like it's so much about the people and about the
mm,
interaction. So the point where like the robbery is almost like incidental, even though that's what it hangs on.
sure, yeah. Um, I wanted to mention like the way Altman got into Nashville because I feel like it
Yeah.
ties into what we're kind of talking about
Do
a
it.
little bit. In the video they mentioned that United Artists wanted to make a film like about the spirit of the country, maybe like in line with like the bicentennial thing. Because when you asked that, Ryan, I was like, I feel like that whole celebration thing was like a propaganda
Yeah.
narrative building tool to like rebuild the spirit of the country.
Yeah.
Especially after the 60s and just like how tumultuous America had been at that time. Like I could totally see the 70s as like
They
trying to
needed a win, basically. Yeah.
yeah, they're trying to sew that shit back together.
Yeah.
And so Altman was kind of seen as this guy who could make a film that could do that. That
Yeah.
like didn't need a narrative through line, that could
Mm.
just capture the spirit of something through like a network of people. And it totally makes sense. And you see it, I feel like, in this film where it's like he's commenting to me, I guess, a lot on the right, like political right of America, but to me, just like the spirit of like that's what I got from this film was like the
Yeah.
spirit of America in general, from everything, right? Like entertainment, politics, like political spectrum, like kind of he was a hippie making a film kind of about traditionally conservative America. Like
Yeah.
there's contradictions across like this whole thing, I feel like that he's kind of playing with and leaning into in a lot of ways.
Well, like even like the introduction of like Jeff Goldblum, who's another feels like almost like incidental character who like doesn't
Yeah, so
quite need to be
random.
there other than like he represents it. It's interesting how like he represents a type of person and a mentality, and like I think that's a really interesting stance to take. But I also give him credit for
Mm,
having like 24 or however many at the
Yeah,
24 or
24.
30
Yeah.
characters in that where everyone is very distinct and everybody represents something, and you really get into the
yeah.
minutia of like even like subcultures and subsets of like you can kind of argue that like there's the trio when Keith Carradine kind of goes off separate. It's a kind of version of Peter, Paul, and Mary, but like
Oh,
even that
totally.
sort of type of singer was like fairly outdated at the time, but we're still going to bring
Hmm.
it back because stuff lingers, you
Yeah.
know,
Hmm.
and this notion of like a lot of films about a year they would made, I feel a lot of the pitfalls are that they think everything they have to reference or address happened that year. Where like life doesn't work like
Hmm.
that. You know, it kind of ebbs and flows, and we're still thinking about stuff that
Hmm.
happened 10 years ago or something that happened, 20 years back. In fact, I mean, even like I largely attribute a lot of the like political assassination notions in the film like to like Kennedy because like that never happened before,
Hmm.
Yeah.
and it's I think let's see, it's like 11 years I think when they're filming it, and then 12 years late, like it's been 12 years since it happened, but it's like we have that, we have Nixon,
Hmm.
the Tet Offensive with Vietnam. It's just like everything's changing in such a rapid way that like I mean even now, not to like bring it back to today, but I still have those moments of like all the political upheaval that we've been going through, like in terms of like there's always been something
Hmm.
bad happening, but in terms of like this modern state of politics is approaching like 8 or 9 years at this point. Like we're
Yeah.
like
Hmm.
really coming close to a decade. And it's
Hmm.
everything's just been fast forwarded in a way that like it wasn't necessarily fast forwarded at the time, back in the 60s
Hmm.
or the 70s. So you can almost sort of see like life moved a little slower back then, but also like these things were so much more radical and terrifying.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do see Altman as like the best director for contemporary time in terms of like understanding who we are and
Yeah.
why we're at this kind of place. It's like
Yeah.
interesting. His this kind of sort of style of filmmaking feels applicable to like this kind of scatterbrained political mess that we're in, where
Yeah.
like all these different voices are directed at different things and colliding with each other and missing each other and stuff like that. So, um,
So
yeah,
kind
it's
of
interesting.
why, like, kind of like to take it on like a brief tangent, like that's kind of also why I'm always a little surprised that like he's not more sort of lauded
Celebrated.
in the sort of like
Hmm.
pretentious like film school kind of way, because
Right.
he is the kind of person who you
Dude,
get stoned
yeah.
and you watch his movies and you yell about like what it meant,
Yeah.
you know, in a way that like I think, but also think in a way that like directly interacts with the form, whereas like not to go off on too much of a
Mm.
tangent, but like there's a lot of movies about people who smoke weed, and this
Hmm.
is a movie made by someone who did, and you really see the inklings of like he doesn't make stoner movies in plotting, but he makes
Yeah.
them in
Hmm.
how they feel and how they kind of vibe, and they kind of move
Yes.
around and they're very meandering. That's
Yes.
like
Oh,
I
Sorry.
always thought, oh
Kevin's
no, you're
going
good.
wild. Kevin's going wild. This is exactly what Kevin needed to hear.
I mean, even too, like you look at like if you put it like shortcut side by side with Magnolia, it's like someone does cocaine and somebody smokes weed, and they're just completely like polar opposite movies that say a lot of the same things,
Hmm.
but they're like just as prescient in terms of what they have to say about people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's set. That's yeah, that's very interesting. I've been wanting to watch Magnolia again for a while for that, and I had a lot of thoughts about how Paul Thomas Anderson is very, he comes from a
Yeah.
very direct line, and I think
Hmm.
I read that he was like the standby director on Altman's last
Oh
film.
yeah, Prayer Home Companion. Yeah, for like
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, and
Mm.
learned a lot about his Altman's choices of music through all these things. But yeah, it is interesting. I feel like
Mm.
I don't know if Paul Thomas Anderson's a stoner, but I wouldn't say his films feel like they're made by a stoner.
Yeah.
But they do take okay, there we go.
Yeah.
Touching the nose. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. He's known for his.
Oh, okay.
I've seen interviews where
The
he's
lore?
like totally.
You
Have
are
seen
right.
that the Punch Drunk Love It Can interview?
Yes.
There's one where he's like just sweating and is like screaming about Adam Sandler movies, and everyone's just kind of sitting there politely, and it's the funniest thing. It's like
I just remember one with Quentin Tarantino, and they're both like,
oh yeah, it's
like the whole time. Yeah,
Quentin's a perfect one. Very interesting. Yeah, the stoner movie without the stoner. I guess MASH has some smoking in it, but that's kind of like it. Like,
and even is very like MASH is an interesting one because it has very specific, like, to kind of bring it back to the sort of insert shot, like very deliberate moments that are there just to almost like kind of like call it out. Like the football, there's a to kind of summarize, there's a football scene and it's just a regular football scene and there's a lot of like humor and cutaways and stuff, but they cut away very deliberately to when they're losing. The losing team is all smoking weed. And then it's also the first studio movie to have the F word. And I kind of thought it was almost going to be a throwaway thing. They cut to one guy before the play starts, and it just cuts to him and he says, "Your fucking head's coming right off." And then it cuts to the wide and the rest of the scene plays out. Like, it's completely unnecessary.
Yeah, they easily could have cut it out, funny. But they kept it. Interesting. Yeah. And I think that plays into, like, Altman had a lot of control to say, or I don't know if he had like how I think it was really just him not wanting to take a shit. But he would say no to these sorts of cuts. And I think I read an example, like they wanted to cut some producer wanted to cut 6 minutes out of shortcuts, and he like punched him and threw him in a pool. Like, I mean, we're talking about like this is a guy that did not want any meddling, was very much an actor's director. So it is it's interesting.
He's also a really interesting filmmaker in that, like, and I feel like some of this is true, especially like, and obviously there's going to be benefits when the medium gets democratized, but we're seeing it a lot today of this sort of notion, you hear about it with Marvel movies and you hear about it with other things, is that like a filmmaker makes something on their iPhone, not to be detrimental or anything. There's some great films that have been shot on iPhones. And then they get the Marvel movie, but then they kind of get railroaded by the executives because the executives say, well, did this person really know how to make a movie? Whereas like you have these people, and I think the last run is you see like Nolan makes a couple movies before he makes Batman, or you see like Ryan Coogler, like he gets Creed, but even that's like kind of a smaller franchise relative to other stuff. And Altman, I think, is one of like the great examples of, for years he made television and industrial films. So you're not really able to question like, well, does he know what he's doing? And those movies are great, but very standardized and very educational and very by book. So he can't do it. He just doesn't want to do it.
This plays into what I talked to Kevin, I feel like, a lot about, which is like, I have a lot of respect for abstract painters, and my respect comes from like, and there's a reason why an abstract painter, you can look at their art and be like, oh my God, I could do that. There's so many people that say that, but so many of them can also paint a beautiful, realistic image. And it's a choice after mastering the art to go in this direction. I think that's kind of what makes the difference. And I think Altman, yes, he knew how to make films on a limited budget. I think that was a big part of like those like little things, and knew how to do TV and all of that. And so when he comes into film, because it's a choice to do it in this kind of like what feels like a lax way to do it to people on set, and like he doesn't know what he's doing. But that's the thing. That's the magic. That's the difference.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely something about like he's a filmmaker too. I very much like think about in terms of like I love his work, but I'm in no rush to see all of his movies because he made a lot of them, and each one is these like kind of long-term experiences that kind of sit with you. But it's also interesting too of like I don't think he definitely had. I think there's this notion of like he had good periods and bad periods, which is like a gross simplification. But then you also have he made movies where there were hits and there weren't. It's like kind of, but even too, you're hearing about McCabe and Mrs. Miller or Buffalo Bill and the Indians, and these films that like they weren't hits at the time. So like a lot of them even didn't connect even then. So each era has something really interesting to go in for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it feels like like I guess I need to watch more to really understand, but I don't know. I
Mm.
think that that is so much of a an effect of the time. Like
Yeah.
there's so many reasons a movie might fail or get the wrong impression, but I mean, if I know Robert Altman from what I've seen so far, I mean, this is a person who he can leave an imprint on stuff. And so if you're watching it, even if it wasn't a success back then or got it, you at least know you're watching an Altman film that it was made a certain way with that technique,
Yeah.
which is something.
Well, even too, like I've been kind of fascinated with his like 90s output and like as much as he's playing around with genre and even kind of being kind of meta in terms of how he approaches things, there's
Mhm.
not really that acknowledgement of like I feel like there's not a lot of discussion, and maybe I'm just not reading the right stuff in film discourse about like that generation of guys in the 90s. Because as much as there's the Tarantinos and the
Mm.
Kevin Smiths and the Paul Thomas Andersons and the Allison Anders, a lot of that happened because the guys who were really big in the 70s who kind of either like bottomed out or started taking paychecks in the 80s now grandfathered in. It's how we get Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's how we get Cape Fear and like these genre movies that are like complete like sort of like
Mm.
formalist subversions of the form, but they can get in because now these guys are the old guards, or like you see
Yeah.
like
Mm.
De Palma comes back after his 80s is a very like staunch, very specific thing that moves in one direction and then just kind of does a 180 moving into the 90s.
Mm.
And I feel like
Yeah.
Allman kind of has a lot of that.
Yeah, it makes me think about how interesting it is that Altman kind of gets lumped into the New Hollywood
Yeah,
thing, and maybe it's just because New Hollywood does have a lot of really unique figures.
yeah,
Altman being one of them, but yeah, and maybe it's also because he was much older, and that there's that kind of aspect of it. Like it just feels like a different person. That maybe he is New
Mm.
Hollywood, but he I don't know. He's just like a different force that is like moving at the same speed as everyone else. So I don't know if that also goes into kind of what you're saying is like, are there really periods I mean, there
yeah,
certainly were like outcast periods of his where he like literally would live outside the country for a
yeah.
time and
Mm.
do other things. And there was that in his life. And maybe that was kind of the difference. I'm not sure.
I think too, it also kind of to your point about him being older, there's a generation of guys who kind of get lumped in there, but we don't really talk about of like Robert Downey Sr. and Dennis
Yeah.
Hopper and Hal
Yeah.
Ashby and these guys who like largely
Mhm.
got bodied by the 80s because of their age, but these guys who I think Spielberg and Lucas and Coppola grew up post-war and kind of were coming of age in a lot of regards when the 60s are happening and social change is happening. And like that's kind of their baseline and Godard and Fellini and all the kind of Chabrol and all these like new wave filmmakers where there's this very specific kind of person. I think you could all even throw like Thomas Pynchon in there of they grew up in like white conservative America. They grew up knowing what they could do and they were artistic, but there was boundaries. You can be industrial filmmakers, you
Mm.
can be novelists. And then these guys kind of went insane because the 60s happened and all of a sudden we can smoke pot and there's sexual liberation and we can do everything we thought was there. And then around Watergate, like and like with the Manson family, it all just gets taken away. And it's like, well, what about that? Like, why are we
Yeah.
going back to where it was before? It's not just getting worse, but it's like getting worse than we thought it did because it's bringing us back to something. Whereas, like, even the fact that like Thomas Pynchon writes Inherent Vice, which is like ostensibly about that, but that came out, at this point 15 years ago. He's
Mhm.
spent most of his life writing about that. Where I feel like Altman's the same way, where he kind of retreats and just makes these kind of human dramas. And then, kind of once the chaos starts out, like I was always surprised he never like and maybe he'd kind of like done it in his contemporary films, but I never really understood why he never made a film about the 60s. And maybe it wasn't his overt interest because at the same time, like
Mm.
the tools of the 60s are not, at least in his eyes to me, like about the 60s, it's how you use them. Whereas
Yeah.
like he's making very formalist films and films that are kind of overtly subverting genre in a way that like Jaws is like a B horror movie, but he's kind of creating a new genre in that moment.
Yeah.
Whereas like McCabe and Mrs. Miller is a Western, even though it's a new type of Western. When Kelly Reichardt makes something that kind of looks like that, or I'm trying to think,
Mm.
there was another one. Like I think I John a blank. These sort of like modern uses, even like Pale Rider or Unforgiven. These films like have elements of that,
Yeah.
but these are all still
Mm.
categorized under Westerns.
Yeah,
Mm.
it's interesting. Yeah, he made movies kind of about what the 60s were about, but never really used that as like a play. And it also makes me really wonder, like, what, I mean, Kevin, you kind of elaborated on like why Nashville, like why he made Nashville, but it is interesting, like why has chosen to make any films about any like certain thing, like why this, why that. And I think, and maybe this might be a perfect time to move on to our next film as things to Secret Honor. And I'm wondering, does anyone have any, I don't know enough about like kind of the background, but why he made this film? Does anyone have like any insight into that?
He had a lot of like sort of, for lack of a better phrase, just rage towards Richard Nixon and the political machine.
Mm-hmm.
And when he's in England and making a lot of his play-based films, you know, Beyond Therapy, Streamers, like one that's really good is like Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean is like incredible. He saw Philip Baker Hall was just doing a one-man show. And it was a combination of, I want to make that, we're going to workshop it. There wasn't even a script. It was just like they built and broke down all the monologues and the plays. And then the thing that's cool is, because like De Palma did a similar thing, and like I have a soft spot for home movies, but it's kind of a mess, is he would teach a course at a college. And what he did was the group, everyone just got together and they made a movie. This was the movie. And he said it was both to sort of obviously like kind of weed out talent and teach people what to do. But there's also this notion, and I think it's kind of beautiful, is like a lot of people who go to film school, especially at that time, you know, and I mean like in our generation, like a lot of people make films in film school and then maybe it doesn't work out or you don't get to make another movie again. A lot of guys never got to do that in film school because you would be gripping for 4 years. Not to like it's a great job, but like you'd be gripping for 4 years and then you couldn't get a job. Whereas he wanted to give people that opportunity to make it. So it's made as a college course and sort of showing like very, I'd say basic, but really fundamental rules of filmmaking that is hard to, I mean, like the movement between dollies and steady cams and jibs and cranes, like all these different uses is something that no one really just sits down and talks about. And he uses it so perfectly in this movie.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so cool. That makes me just think about my my film school experience and how I was very fortunate. I was able, like, we had like a student run production company that had like, you know, dozens of students in it, and we'd like run like a Kickstarter and we'd like get funding from the school and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I was the director of these films. I was lucky enough to like get in that position. Same. And just thinking about like, yeah, there's so many people that don't have that ability to do that. And it would be very different if it was a film directed, if like everyone was working on a film directed by Robert Altman. Like obviously that would be a very different sort of thing versus like a film directed by Ryan Massey in college. It comes with its own unique challenges and insights. But yeah, no, that I feel like Kevin and I have chatted about this before, just like how vital it is to lift up the film school experience. Yeah. And it feels like there's so much more to do to really make it more than what it is, to really be a celebration of creativity and all of these things. And so it's very neat to see that, and that he decided to do that. Like what an interesting choice for this specific individual to decide, like, all right, I'm going to go to a college, I'm going to teach a course, I'm going to do this. I'd be very curious, like what he saw as like the thing, or I mean, maybe he was just like I think an altruistic individual where he just wanted to kind of share this stuff. I don't necessarily think he was a selfish guy, but just interesting.
Well, it also just seems kind of interesting to me too, how like we had kind of discussed, it feels so antithetical that I wonder if it was like a shot for him to kind of try something different.
Yeah.
You know, and the ways in which like the use of the gun or the different screens, like he's building these other characters and like imbuing them with life, and yet it's really just the one guy and it's just moving. And the fact that he's like fascinating, and it's like this weird, like there's so much like pathos without like, I think the movie humanizes Richard Nixon without like sympathizing with him. Like I don't come out of it feeling better about Richard Nixon. You know, if anything, you dislike him more. And yet there's that kind of notion of like, quote unquote, like none of this happened, but it's all true, of like, we don't know what he said when he was alone, but you know it was something like this, and you know that it was just, whereas like you look at like, I mean, like, have you guys seen Nixon, the Oliver Stone film?
I have not. No, no, it is on
It's
my list.
fascinating because it's like a Shakespearean tragedy. Like it's that, but also everybody else is talking the same way and it's all happening around them. And it's like
Mm,
it's great in its own right, but I also think there's something so masterful about like, no, it's about the one guy. Like
yeah,
we care about Haldeman and Ehrlichman and John Dean because of their relation to Richard Nixon and
yeah,
how he affected the country.
yeah.
Whereas like the other stuff is almost like kind of moot point when you like compare it to everything else. It's just at the end of the day, it was one guy who made decisions, and some of them helped him out, and some of them really did it. And a lot of the ones that helped really like fucked over the country.
Yeah. Yeah, I really wish I could put myself in that exact time because I feel like this
Yeah.
movie is just I read Roger Ebert's review of it and it's a very glowing review. And because Roger Ebert was like a staunch fan of Altman through all these times, which is pretty cool.
Mm.
But it just seems like it was steeped in so much that I don't get, I don't understand. Obviously, we have our own kind of interpretation of him ever since. I have a unique interpretation of Nixon because my like little fun fact of where I grew up was his birthplace. And like the Richard Nixon Public Library or the Presidential Library
Oh yeah.
is located in Yorba Linda, which is where I grew up. And in elementary school, we would go there on trips. Has like
Isn't his
Marine One
house
out.
there?
Yeah, his
Yeah,
house. They
they put the
moved his
house there.
exactly. They literally moved the house to the museum. So I have like this weird, and I think that's why this film also like landed in a really strange place in my mind because Richard Nixon kind of just lives like a ghost inside my head and is my own weird uh, presidential library interpretation, which is that he was the most amazing president ever. Obviously, the presidential library is not going to say anything bad about the
Yeah.
guy. And obviously, I don't think that about Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
I do understand, but there's just it makes me just beg for context,
Yeah.
and I always wish, and I'm always interested in like what it would have been like to see any movie at the time it came out because it
Yeah.
adds so much to it. I think,
Fair.
and this one especially, I was just like, damn. I feel like I would have loved it even more if I saw it at the time
Yeah.
and knowing because I think Richard Nixon was still alive when it came out too.
Yeah, I think it's about like 10 years also too. Like it's roughly a decade after Watergate, but also
Yeah,
roughly like a decade before he gets pardoned. So it's like every 10
Mm.
years, he's in this kind of weird middle ground of like, what's his cultural legacy? Like for
yeah,
me, it was always like, to me, this is kind of like I had a similar thing where it wasn't like specifically an obsession with Nixon, but I really loved the book All of President's Men, and then that gets turned into a great movie, and then kind of the sort of like what was Watergate? Because it was
yeah,
reading All the President's Men mixed with like not understanding. Because the thing about the Oliver Stone film is that they don't explain what Watergate is. You're just
mm,
like in the shit and it's happening and everyone's paranoid. Where like there's something about his portrayals of like he either plays himself in films that were set in the 70s where we're just going to use cut footage of Nixon, or it's these like huge hyperbolic kind of like Ron Howard's Frost Nixon or
yeah.
Nixon with Anthony Hopkins. And it's like, and this is one to me that just feels very human and in a way that isn't read like all of those are reenacting real events, and this one is making like
Mm.
zero effort to do that. And yet you kind of get to the heart of like what does this guy really want? Like what are we really fighting for in relation to like him and like his cultural relevancy and his legacy?
It makes me like I think the obvious thing that people would say is like, oh, a Donald Trump version of this
Yeah,
seems like an obvious thing, but I'm more interested in like a Hillary Clinton
yeah,
version of
Oh,
this
yeah,
because I think that's a much more nuanced, kind of insane
yeah,
thing to watch. Is just like these people that have like so much that are so self-centered,
yeah,
like crazy, and like what that does to your mind.
yeah. We're
Yeah,
mhm.
like
just
as
imagining, yeah.
we're like as much as we talk about like Donald Trump as an entity or like cultural legacy, he's one of those people where like I mean personally I find him very uninteresting, but I also think like even if you were interested in digging deep into what he is, almost everything he does is public record. It's
Yeah.
like we don't even really address how bizarre it is that like there was a New York real estate mogul who was famous enough, like even like we joke about the whole Home
TV
Alone
star.
cameo. Yeah, but like imagine if like I don't know, like if some sort of local hero, like if do you know who Cal Naughton Jr. is?
I do not know.
Google him. He was in the 80s. He did like cable access commercials, and I'm Cal Nat Jr. and this is my dog. But every time he would show the dog, it would be a different animal. And he would rent out weirder and weirder animals just like for clout. But it's almost like, imagine if that guy was in a major movie. Like, it was kind of a joke, but like, or like if Eric Andre was in something, these kind of figures that, like, it's weird the way in which Donald Trump progressed to be famous in like a matter of the public eye and public record. Whereas you look at, like, we know about the Clintons and we know about the Kennedys, but like, we know about a very curated image of them because that image was a defense and wasn't the gateway into being famous.
Yes.
It was, they were about policy and power and economics, and you have to be a public figure to do that stuff. So we kind of have to sort of play this sort of game of what can we tell and what we can't tell. Whereas like Donald Trump, it's just all on the table for kind of no apparent reason.
Totally. Yeah. You can look back. You can look back so much and be like, they've been parodying this man for so long. Back to the Future Part 2 being one I talked about recently. It's just like, they've been doing this a long time. And so, a little less interesting.
Did you cover that Bob Gale quote where he said in the second one, they wrote a draft where he was president and they cut it because they're like, it's bullshit. It'll never happen.
Oh my God.
And they were just like, they were so off. We're like, he just kind of owns everything because we can't say he's president. But like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that would be such a weird choice to have made. I'm happy they kept it the world small, but it is, I mean, it seemed insane. It seemed insane in 2016. And that's why like Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party like edged him on to keep doing it, because they're like, there's no way. And he also, from everything we can read, is like, he didn't really think it was going to happen either. Where like Richard Nixon was so like disgustingly obsessed with power. And I mean, all the way back to like those initial presidential debates and everything like that. And you can just see like this guy was thirsty. And
you hear about like how he goes to broker a deal to end the Vietnam War and then says, if we can stove it off for a couple years, I can be president, and then we can talk again. It's like, to me, that's a calculation that Donald Trump doesn't have in him. That's a calculation that George Bush doesn't have in him. These aren't guys who are like making those calculations.
Like cunning.
Where Nixon was very much like, there is this sort of like evil genius quality to him. And this sort of like, it's all, there is a road, we're going to take it, we're going to make it work in spite of everything else.
And Kissinger being like the perfect right-hand man for that too. Obviously another evil mastermind.
No, that's what I think of Clinton too. Like,
I think that would be an interesting take on kind of a new modern secret honor would be a Clinton version.
To kind of go on off of the style comment that Sam said earlier, and just talk about how this is like the antithesis of Altman. I was kind of surprised at like how minimal it goes with it being like a one-man show, and that I kind of saw the maximalism in the production design, cinematography, and then like the development of this character.
There's a really weird artifice to it. And it feels like, it very much feels sort of like the old, like, where they would shoot television plays live for TV, but at the same time, like, it's not hindered by that. It's very much like in a mindset and in a person space, and like
it's painterly
how it reflects him as a person.
I love that thing you said, Kevin. I think it does really, it feels like it turns the knob down on so much else. But it turns it up, I mean, to an insane amounts. Like, it's like you're watching a psychotic breakdown almost. Like it just comes in and out, and it's so uncomfortable to watch. That is interesting, that like thinking about the dial kind of imagery and deciding like, okay, we're going to, this time around, we're going to turn the characters up a lot. Pretty cool.
What do you guys think of like the use of the camera and like television?
I think it's a really like fascinating idea, because I mean, especially like, to me, I'm always thinking about like, and it's not really like a negative, but like, how do we make a play feel less like a play? And I feel like this is a film that really does that, in terms of like the use of his amping up, and his chaos and his energy and his performance amped up with it being literally reflected back onto him, I think is one of like the greatest translations of one medium to another. Because you can imagine what it's like
Mm.
seeing that as a play and this dude just screaming and sweating and jumping around. But the fact that like he's doing that enough so well that it plays on camera, and then on top of that, there's like 100 of them, and it just kind of is this like really like disturbing echo chamber. I
Yeah.
think is just fascinating.
Ooh,
You
echo
know?
chamber.
I like that.
That feels right. Yeah, because I love the use of
Yeah.
those cameras. That's just so cool. And
Mm.
knowing Nixon was obsessed with that sort of thing, recording everything, and it really they found a way to visually make it really interesting. I think that's
Yeah.
such a cool way to do that. It's
Yeah.
just it seems psychotic. Like this guy, I mean, it almost feels like the security guard at the mall that has
Yeah.
in the room with
Hmm.
all the screens and everything like that.
Yeah.
Um,
To me, it was
but
like
also a detective.
fragmentation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Fragment.
detective.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, just like the schism of this person, like
Mm,
with the cameras and stuff. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. He was definitely cracking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no, and just what an amazing performance by Philip Baker Hall. I
Oh, it's
mean, I
incredible.
just mind blowing. And it's so great to see
Literally.
him really move. Yeah, see him move on to do some really amazing work in the Paul Thomas Anderson
Yeah.
films, and it's just like,
Mm.
oh my gosh, this is he fits into this kind of really. Well, he looks good sweating. I know that's a weird
Yeah.
thing to say, but he just looks stressed out so much.
Yeah.
And I think about like him in Magnolia, and I just think like Jesus, like
Yeah.
this. Yeah, it's so
That's
funny.
so wetty.
And
Sweating, not like that. I
but
got
it's
no
kind
problem
of
with that.
crazy like going back, and like he was another one where it's like I knew him as bit parts of like the Paul Thomas Anderson movies and Midnight Run and a lot of like
Mm.
sitcom spots and stuff, but it's like, or like he's great in the like the Insider in a couple scenes, but like it's interesting going back and being like, oh no, his first one of his first things was a starring role,
Yeah.
and it was like it's kind of like he's great in everything, but like it's cool that it wasn't like, oh, he finally got a shot. It's like this is the shot that defined everything. Like
Yes.
you watch this and you're like, oh, he can do it. Like everything makes sense after
Yes.
seeing this performance.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I had to look up. I looked up young. Uh. Oh my God. His name just that Philip Baker Hall. Wow, that was really bad. I looked up young Philip Baker because I was just really curious. I'm like, one of those actors that we just know old.
Yeah.
And yeah, so
Sorry.
and he did not look the way I expected. I was like, oh, but
Yeah.
he had been working for a while. So yeah, that was pretty cool.
I do kind of wonder like what theater was like at the time and like what
Mm,
kind of
Television.
like, yeah. And like a lot of like in terms of what how that interacted with the culture.
Mhm.
And you hear about a lot of, I think a lot of more actors came out of theater at the same time. A lot of actors deliberately chose theater as an option, as like a viable kind of comparable alternative to film. And you hear about, I mean, you hear about some actors where it's like they're working, but you don't hear about them being in movies until they're older because they've had these like illustrious um theater careers.
yeah.
Mhm.
And like, all the different new methods and schools of acting like are still like relatively new.
Yeah, it's a good
Yeah.
point. I don't know enough about schools of acting, but it's yeah. I would be curious like when kind of the branching off started
Yeah.
and where it'd be an interesting thing for us to look at one of these days, Kevin, is that kind of like acting styles. I think that would be
Yeah.
neat. Yeah.
I know it starts branching at least in America, like in the 50s and 60s,
Okay.
I want to
Because isn't
say.
it like the sort of like Strasberg,
Yeah.
Meisner, and like them
Those are the ones
learning
I know.
from
Yeah.
Stanislavski, and then
Hmm.
sort of like everyone kind of taking different things from that practice and then spiraling into all the different notions.
Exactly. Exactly. And so by the like 70s and 80s, you get a lot of stuff on even the West Coast, like San Francisco,
Mm,
in terms of like different styles and stuff like that. Like Coppola, I know studied at a school up here somewhere.
Yeah.
mm.
That was like derivative of this kind of breaking that happened earlier. And a lot of it is kind of detailed in what's his name? Ilya Kazan's
Yeah.
book.
Mm.
He has like this expose, so to speak, about his life and like everything he experienced and stuff. And he talks a lot about like, because he was friends with a lot of these people, Meisner and Strasberg and people like that. So he kind of talks about the timeline and when everything was happening and stuff like that.
Well, like
Interesting.
I always thought it was kind of a funny like sort of comparison and trains of thought of like both Lee Strasberg and Sanford Meisner like in a matter of years play gangsters, and both roles couldn't
Hmm.
be more indicative of like their school of acting. And in a
Mm,
Strasberg, it's
Oh.
very grand and epic and metaphorical, and Meisner's just this like guy in a chair, and
Yeah.
he's running everything, but it's just very depleted and very realistic and just kind of like moving around in
Yeah.
this way that feels very humanistic, but not in a like self-aggrandizing way.
Yeah. Wow. That's a good point. Yeah.
mm. Okay. Let's keep
Yeah.
moving.
Yeah.
We're now on our fourth film here. One that I enjoyed very much, Shortcuts.
This is my favorite too. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
so good.
Yeah,
It's
1993. You can see taking this form, and I looked up hyperlink cinema is what they call like kind of this genre of like multiple stories kind of, and you could see this feels like Nashville perfected
yeah.
in a lot of ways, at least
Yeah.
in the form. I think yeah, it says something a little different to me, but
Yeah.
it still it feels like the form has figured it out. It just melds amazingly.
To me,
What's
and like
different
so
for,
many.
sorry.
Oh, sorry, you could go.
No, I was just curious what's different for you between this and Nashville.
um I it I think that the like I think Nashville is very overt in what it's saying about America. It
Mm.
feels like Shortcuts. You could, in some ways, I take it as like, oh, that's LA. Like you could definitely play it up as like, okay, this is LA. This is that kind of culture. Maybe you can kind of build it out, but maybe as someone who grew up in Southern California, it just feels very LA minded. Where
Mhm.
Nashville feels like this, it feels so America and grandiose, and culminating to this like really big scene at the end that makes sense. Where like Shortcuts does a scene like its ending is confusing,
Yeah.
but there's definitely a lot you can think about, a lot you can pull from it. So that's kind of they just kind of talked about it differently. Obviously, just say a lot of same things about the culture and a lot of like, what really matters in a lot of ways. Everyone's kind of going about. Everyone has like this really materialistic perspective on everything. Like everyone's doing something
Mm.
for a specific reason. I feel like you really get that in Shortcuts, and it's just like you happen to
Mhm.
collide with other people's interests and what they're kind of like going through. And I guess that's just hyperlink cinema, but it just does it really well and it makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's what
definitely. I feel like to me, it feels like one of his more human films in terms of like, and
Mhm.
this was just like my takeaway of like so many of his films are subversions of we're acting this way because it's a genre, or we're all in this place, or we all have to
Mhm.
act accordingly because we're kind of on this like grand sort of moving train. And this one to me very much had this sort of sense of inertia of everything that happens is because everybody is around us and we're defined by the interactions and the sort of little things of
Mm.
like those kind of moments where someone sees someone do something, or somebody like even like I love the scene where they get the photos developed, and both people are just kind of like one
Concerned.
group is concerned, but also like Buck Henry doesn't know that the pictures of Lily Taylor aren't real.
Yeah.
Like he's just kind of so everyone's just kind of in this sort of like, isn't it weird that that happened, and this kind of like sort of like indictment of suburbia, and like you don't want everything to get in the way of your thing, but everyone is thinking that. So we're all
Yeah.
kind of working together to kind of make a worse world. And I think it's kind of fascinating that like the ways in which he interacted, or not interacted, interconnected the different films of Raymond Carver and the different like stories to sort of tell, because it's like a lot of those stories are saying something fundamentally different than what the film is saying because they're isolated. But through
Yeah.
interconnecting them, I feel like you really have this sort of clear vision of what's happening. Like the story with Robert Downey Jr. taking the photos of Lily Taylor, that's a different story than him and Chris Penn in the two stories. But by like meshing them together, it's a sort of like juxtaposition of toxic masculinity and like
Mm.
how,
Oh,
that he's very kind of crass and overtly sort of misogynistic and is taking these sort of lewd photos, but he's not killing people. He's not bottling everything up to the point where he's hurting someone else in like
yeah.
in an actual like way where it's unclear, but like we're pretty sure he kills her. Like he is like it's a violent moment.
Yeah, it feels so like,
Surprising.
yeah, it's so surprising that that happened all of a sudden. And it just goes with Kevin, I don't want to take away your thing, but Kevin had a really good like analogy for it. And I
Yeah.
do feel, yeah, it was just like just like everything was being torn apart.
Yeah.
And that just was a really great visual representation of just like that happens and the movie's not going back anymore. It's
Yeah.
like now we're and it's just different. It was just so weird.
But it's almost this like weird Deus Ex Machina where like a natural disaster has to happen in terms of like all the stuff with the pesticides, which is it's like a natural disaster and yet it is man-made.
Yeah.
And then between the murder, like where do we go from here? And we need this sort of like shock and awe sort of act of God to just bring us all down.
Yeah.
Yeah, I described it as shaking the snow globe. Like it just felt like Deus Ex Machina is a great description too. Just like needed something to like shake everything together.
Yeah. And like so much of it is, I think that there's something about like the sort of uncomfortable nature of it and the like sort of, for lack of a better phrase, like the horror that emerges from it being mundane. Like there's a whole film with Gabriel Byrne and Laura Linney that's adapted from the subplot about the fishermen who find the dead body.
Oh, really?
And it's very much pushed in like it's dramatic and it's a character study and it's very like sort of Michael Mann meets Marriage Story, and it's like it's great, but it's not
what the fuck.
What upsets me about that story.
Yeah.
Is what scares me is that it's incidental and no one cares.
It's so callous. Like and that, oh my God, and I watched the movie and I felt like I knew so many of those people, like just like these, like that it really doesn't matter what's outside of our thing. It's just like literally what's in front of us is all that matters. And that felt like a great representation of that. And just like all of these little decisions that they made to like tie her up. And it's like, that says so much about how much they really care. And oh my God. And it was great that he like, he mentioned that I think that they're married, but to his wife, I forget the actor's name, but mentions to her like, hey, like, oh yeah, I found that body or whatever. And it's just like, it tears everything apart because you start to, if a lot of these people said to another person exactly what they're doing, the person would yell, you'd be crazy. Like everyone has that, like, they're just like one person removed from realizing they're insane.
Well, it's such a small scene, but it always like kind of scared me in a bizarre way is when Tim Robbins takes the dog back from the kid. But the thing that I caught this time that I think is fascinating is that Huey Lewis is the dad and is one of the fishermen. And the fact that like, the thing at the lake meant nothing to him. Like Buck Henry still has the photos and Fred Ward still has to talk with his wife about everything that happened. Where the third guy, he's kind of leaves and he kind of goes on.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
And now, he got a dog. Like, it's just you live your life. Like, it's so depraved in this, like, really kind of striking way.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I don't know enough about, like, the process or anything of what went into, like, combining all these stories. But I feel like just by, like, melding them together, it's insane, like a Kuleshov effect sort of thing. Like, all of a sudden you look at this is totally different now. Now that we just throw in this other character that had this other thing and has this other backstory, and is that just how life is? And this is like, because Altman, he talks about just like how important it was for him to like set a scene, and why would he shoot a dinner scene without people talking over each other? Because it'd be weird if just two people at a dinner were talking to each other.
Yeah.
It feels like you put all these pieces and all of a sudden you just see the thread of like what life is. And this just felt like a great representation of that, right?
Right. Just like blending multiple things.
And and it's
Yeah.
just like by doing it, it becomes it. Like you don't even
Yeah.
have to
Right.
be all that intentional with trying to hit that. It's just like
Right.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if it's coming across, but
No,
it's a
No,
weird
definitely, yeah.
concept. It's
it's
so
just a
strange.
blob and it is what it is. And you
Yeah,
can like look at it from different angles and stuff
Yeah.
like
yeah,
that and like have a different experience every time you watch it. But like
yeah,
it'll always just be this thing. Yeah.
And like being
yeah,
kind of
Especially with this film, like because of how like rigid and structured it feels, but also it's like also random and
yeah.
also
yeah.
just like its own world kind of a thing. Yeah. There's no story or like message, but it just like you can take whatever you want from it kind of a thing, I feel like. Because there's so much going on. To me, this was like the metaverse movie.
Yeah.
Like if that was ever a thing, like this felt like, oh, it's these are just lives that like are happening kind of a thing to me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I guess that's why he was perfect for Nashville. It was that same sort of idea of just like, all right,
Right.
we these are just people and plots, and now it's let's throw it all together
Yeah.
and put it, and then you kind of find meaning by just looking, and maybe it's also like going to a museum and looking at a painting and just like, or even an abstract painting
Yeah.
and just like pulling meaning out of it. And it doesn't mean that there wasn't meaning in it before, or maybe it wasn't even the artist's intent, but
Right.
you can give anything meaning. I mean, we like see people's faces in crackers and things like that. Like you can pull anything out of anything, and this is a good way of seeing like, oh man, there's a lot that just is just by putting the pieces into one little pot.
Yeah. He's definitely playing with like tropes, like story elements as like colors or brush strokes. Like
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's just like a yeah, painting I feel like is the perfect kind of metaphor. It's just like becomes a layered blob of thing and then you can pick out like the meaning or message from it. Yeah.
Yeah, just kind of like each one feels kind of like he's like you're saying, just sort of taking out the elements of like what's most effective in this story, where it's not really like an anthology of like we're showing this and then we're showing this and then we're showing this. Because there's a lot of those stories
Right.
where like
Like
there's a
kinds of
whole
kindness.
yeah, there's this kind of like whole element of he's taking out the moments that are most effective for each character without it being like we have to do a full through line. Or and I think that's kind of what's funny about the ending is that it's like, well, we kind of need to wrap all this up and just
Yeah,
like
that
remind
is kind of how
everyone
it
that we're so
feels.
together.
Yeah, yeah. Is it's just like, all right, let's get a move on. And obviously in Southern California, the big one has always been like it
Yeah.
always, and oh, I guess maybe it's up here too. Is that like a Bay Area
Earthquake.
thing too?
Yeah.
Like yeah, it's just maybe it's just a full California thing, but just always like the big one's just around the corner. And
Yeah.
Yep.
that kind of plays into this a little bit. And then I think at the end, the earthquake happens and they say, oh, that wasn't the big one. And it just
Yeah.
also makes you think like, oh my God, like there's even it's because they also
Like
just go
nothing
back.
matters. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And maybe it is more like Nashville than I gave it credit for. Is like it has that kind of ending of like,
Mm,
wow, that just happened. And now
Yeah.
we're just gonna go back to this. And I think it's always interesting hearing people that come to California and like earthquakes are terrifying to them.
Yeah.
And for those of us here, it's kind of like, oh, it's just a
Yeah.
thing. Like it doesn't really like matter all that
yeah.
much. It's just a thing that happens. And I guess that's why it also just feels like a really great LA, California kind of movie. I think it hits it on the nose, hits it on the
Mm,
head.
yeah.
Yeah. Wow. We
Oh.
go, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, as like a wrap up, I guess, I
Yeah.
definitely see Altman as like a meta modern director,
Mm.
like in the
Ooh.
way he can balance these two things. Because I think a lot of from the video that I watched, I think a huge portion of discourse surrounding this director is like, is he a satirical director or is he like uh, a sentimental or like whatever kind of romantic director, so to say? Um, because of the way it could be both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel like that speaks to metamodernism in a way. Like he's kind of oscillating between the two poles of like irony and like romanticism. Like he is obviously very critical of America in like films like Shortcuts or Nashville or Secret Honor, but at the same time he shows like an appreciation for it and like a reverence for it. Like he can be both things at the same time. Like it carries meaning, but it is meaningless, and we just carry on
Yeah.
is sort of like the sentiment in all of his films. Like it just is, and that's how it goes, sort of a thing. Like I feel like that is the message of metamodernism to me. Yeah.
Kevin's always got to tie it back to
Yeah.
metamodernism, and that's not a rip. That's great.
Yeah,
That's your thesis on these things, and
yeah.
yeah, I agree.
How I
But I
read
feel
the
like
world.
Altman
Yeah.
is like one of the perfect examples of that. And
Mhm.
how just like
Mhm.
these things have meaning because we say they have meaning. This thing isn't
Yeah.
inherently important, but if it affects all of us, we're the people who are driving stuff.
Yeah.
So, it's about what affects people and how we interact with each other.
Yeah,
God,
that's great.
God damn,
That was
God
good. That was a
damn.
good one.
That was very good. Okay, let's do a little cool down real quick as we kind
All
of
right.
wind
Yeah.
these things down. I'm just curious,
Wind, reel,
Sam.
and print.
Yeah, wind, reel, and
Sorry.
print. We're not just
Not
yet.
there yet. Yeah, yeah.
But Sam, like just to kind of like take it back, do you remember your first movie watching experience? Like what was I guess let's start with, do you remember what your first one was? Like when it kind of opened?
I think it was I think it was Nashville was the first one because I don't remember like specifically like the thing that really stood out to me was seeing it, and I was kind of just getting into like watching movies and watching, if I watch a movie every day, I'm gonna watch it a lot. And there was some class like field trip, and we did one of those trips where you go to Washington DC and you like see everything.
Oh yes, I
And I
did.
saw
Yeah.
that like a couple days before I left, and it just kind of, and didn't watch
What
a movie for a
the
week because
fuck?
you're on a field, so you're just kind of sitting looking around and kind of seeing this like weird spectacle. And this was right
Whoa.
around that time that
What the fuck?
Ted Cruz had shut down the government.
Oh
So it was like
yeah.
reopening, but it was kind of this weird ghost town. And the thing is like we talk
Huh.
about it as a tourist track, but you walk around that city, there's something really off-putting about like you really see the sort of like showmanship and the spectacle when there's not a million people there. And just that all this
Yeah.
stuff is just sort of like erected for no reason. It's all just, I mean, we literally call them monuments. They're just these like huge statues and essentially like, I mean, they're
Uh,
they're not religious, but they are temples. Like they
Oh
are
yeah.
these sort of like places of worship for whatever this country represents. And I think it was just this sort
that's
of
so
thing
funny.
of
I love
like
that. I love that. Sorry.
That's
figuring out,
so
no, you're good.
that's so
And
that's
so
so
like going from there.
yeah, that's so interesting because I thought you didn't understand my question by saying Nashville, but
Yeah.
Right, same.
Nashville really was
Yeah.
your wow, that's so
Yeah.
crazy. Wow, perfect. It's kind of
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah.
I think
Huh.
I knew about the other ones, but it was very much specifically like I
So,
think there were reasons to see or not see the other ones, or I want to save that, or I want to kind of really kind of like, what does this mean? And Nashville, it was just like it looked interesting, and it also was very clear through criticism and reviews that I'm like, you need to experience this,
what
you know.
grade was this for you?
Eighth grade.
Wow.
Dang. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah, I didn't like mine was There Will Be Blood was kind of like this big kind
Oh
of like
yeah, that's a good
eye-opening
one.
moment
Yeah,
for me. And that I
Mm,
mean I didn't hit that until high school. So that's major props
oh, thank
yeah.
you.
to getting that early. I was watching a
Yeah,
lot of
that's early.
yeah, Jurassic Park at that time.
I mean, I had like good teachers and stuff. I had a teacher who, for some reason, was like
Huh.
obsessed with French New Wave and really was like, "Well, this will be
Uh,
interesting," or "This will be." Like, I remember really liking Breathless because for some
hmm.
reason he didn't like it, and that was one that I felt like I had found. Because it's like
Ooh,
people
Mm,
weren't,
yeah.
and it's like as much as I know it's part of discourse now, it's like it was something that was very to me, there's not a lot of, and it's not a criticism, but there's not a lot of overlap with that and the kind of like Spielberg Coppola world in terms of how we discuss it, whereas
Hmm.
like,
uh-huh.
you go back and you look at Spielberg and there's a lot of new wave stuff and kind of how he approaches stuff, but at the same time you have those kind of like
Hmm.
I experienced the like Tarantino, Paul Thomas Anderson, like those were my guys in high school, so I kind of circled back onto them
Hmm.
after, just because it was a lot of like what was available and sort of like what are you allowed to watch. It was a lot of old movies and a lot of just stuff that's like, I mean, this is like
Mm.
pre streaming being big. So it's like, what's the library? What's on
Yeah.
TV? What do you? And I kind of like I make an effort to try to find it where I can, but I do kind of miss that. Like you just kind of stumble upon this weird thing,
I
you
know.
know?
Yeah, I that's something I like about, though I don't use it myself, but the Criterion channel has
Yeah.
that like 24/7 thing. And
Oh,
I
I love
wish,
that thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
and whenever I go to my wife's parents' house, they always have Turner Classic on. And
Yeah.
it's so, I've discovered so many weird movies by just walking in and being
Mhm.
like, what is on the TV? This is insane.
Yeah.
Yeah, there needs, we need more of that. We just need more ways to experience it, because there's so many movies that I feel like we're watching for this podcast, and I'm just like, what more people need to see all this. And Sam, you're one of
Yeah.
the few people that I've met that has like, I mean, I feel like you've seen definitely everything I've seen, but maybe that's incorrect.
Everyone has their thing. Like
Yeah,
I
but it
feel like
still
no
is
one
just like,
knows.
man,
Yeah.
your well is
Oh, thank you.
crazy how deep
Thank you.
that well goes. Just how many movies do you watch? Because I know Kevin watches a lot. How many movies do you watch?
Oh,
Like,
Sam watches way more than
way
me.
more?
Well, I just
Yeah,
kind of have it.
way
To me,
more.
it's like I like to say like I watch movies the way that people listen to music. Where like
Mm,
I do a lot of remote work and a lot of like stuff online around the apartment. So like I'll just kind of have it on in the background
Yeah.
and kind
ah,
of trying to figure out like I'll still like I love going to the movies. I love sitting down and watching something and seeing something new. But it's always like what do I can find in that thing, you know?
yeah.
Like there's this kind of as much as everything is on streaming now, there's this kind of weird like self-imposed parameters I like where it's like if you rent a movie or they're taking off a streaming service, it's like no, you kind of need to like get in and get everything you can out of that movie before it's like gone. It's
Mm.
never gone, but like it's
Oh,
not. We kind of have to find those sort of like ways in which to back ourselves into a corner so you're forced to pay attention.
that's what
Mm.
this podcast is for me. Is like I just needed a
Mm.
reason to watch more movies.
Yeah.
Like for a while, it was the 1001 movies to
Yeah.
see before we die. I was like, okay, I'm just going through the checklist alphabetically.
Yeah.
I gave myself like alphabetically. That's how I'm going to
Nice.
watch
Yeah.
these movies, which is hilarious. Like
Yeah.
I've seen so many of this
No,
lives
that's
like this.
wild to just like where that takes you at any given moment.
That's the interesting thing, and I think that's what we kind of get from this podcast is the interesting overlap and just kind of like going from one to another, how it affects the next viewing and over, and how
Mm.
this well is deepening mine especially.
Yeah.
And yeah,
I
I
feel
mean,
like, yeah.
yeah, and I like, I don't mean to totally wrap this up for you, Kevin, if you have anything else you want to say, but Sam, I'm just so happy that you decided to come on this. This was a really amazing conversation. It got me to watch these amazing Altman films. I thought I kind of understood Altman from like an arm's length, but these were like, oh, a perfect little meal of films that I think they say a lot about all the different aspects of Altman. So it's just really cool, and I
Mm.
really appreciate it.
No, thank you. I'm happy to hear that. Like I'm really glad to be able to be on this and talk about this stuff. It's always like just like such a privilege and such like a fun thing to be able to talk stuff. And also just hearing that like that's kind of what I wanted to get out of these films is like I feel like you can watch one or
Mm.
two of his films and grasp what he does in a general sense, but like you really have to he's one of the filmmakers where like you need to think about him as a guy and where he was at in context and like how that ages or doesn't age well or in relation to like what we're going through now. Because a lot of his
Yeah.
stuff is like he has this really interesting thing where and I think like we were talking about it with Medmodernism, if you read him as a satirist, he's one of the few satirists where his films look like the films that they're satirizing. You know, where
Mhm.
like Mel Brooks does a lot of it, but you look at like even though it's not satire, like you look at like Bogdanovich in The Last Picture Show, or like
Mhm.
Bonnie and Clyde kind of looking like a French New Wave movie, an older movie, or like The Graduate kind of looking like a Billy Wilder movie in a lot of regards. And these kind of ways in which they're playing with form. And like MASH, they say that MASH, a lot of what he got away with in MASH was because they were making Patton and Tor. And if you watch those movies back to back, they all look like the same movie,
Mm.
even though like one is so much more grittier and so much more subversive.
Yeah. Oh, that's a
Mm.
good, yeah, that's a good connect.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I guess that's where the metamodern is too, right? In
Yeah,
the formal, in the way he treats like the formal aspects of the film. Like
yeah,
he's satirizing this genre, but at the same time, like showing an appreciation for it to where it's almost exactly the same as the genre that he's
yeah,
kind of satirizing or pointing at.
yeah,
Um, yeah, which I think is the craziest, like kind of what you said in the beginning with Altman as a director. Like after I watched all these movies, I was like, that's a good movie, but like I don't know if I like if that's like one of my favorite, if that lands in my favorite or like list of favorites. But like to this day, it's still like a month since I've seen these films. I can think of each and every one in a very distinct and like thorough manner because they're all very complex and like chunky, like, and that speaks to his filmmaking and like the treatment that he applies to all these things. It's pretty amazing. Yeah. I forgot what my point was, but
you're
like,
just happy.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that.
I mean, as long as we get to talk about all this stuff, like,
yes.
I mean, I definitely saw the influence that he had on, like you said, all your favorite directors, like on all the directors of today, like Linklater, PTA, Tarantino, like so many people are pulling from the way he's even just constructing a movie. Like it's all kind of birthing the new independent cinema of the 90s and 2000s that I think we see today, that we end up seeing today,
There we go. I think that's it, folks. I think that's a perfect ending. So I want to thank you again, Sam, for being here. Really appreciate it. Yeah. And Kevin, you want to send us out?
That's a wrap.
Bye, folks. We'll see you next time.
Woo! Blind Reel in Print is a podcast by Salad Brain Productions. You can find us on Instagram at Wind Reel in Print Pod. You can also find us wherever you get your podcasts. And please, if you like the show, leave a rating and review. We'll see you next time.